Homework, bedtime stories, baths, school projects, even diaper changes. Most Black fathers are present and accounted for daily when it comes to those duties and many more. But far too often, Black fatherhood is marginalized and distorted with false stats and myths that, quite frankly, for decades have been given Black dads a very bad reputation. Good evening and welcome to another special edition of the Daily Drum in collaboration with our sister station WHUT-TV. For the next hour, we're going to take a look at fatherhood in the Black community, the successes, challenges, and the true difference Black fathers are making in the lives of their children and our communities daily. We have a panel of dads to shape tonight's conversation. While their pathway to fatherhood is different, there is commonality. They are all intimately involved in the lives of their children. Of course, we will not take phone calls tonight, but we invite you to join the conversation online using the hashtag Black Fatherhood. Tonight's discussion is being streamed live on WHUR.com, Facebook, and YouTube. Let's introduce our dads. Roderick Avery, a 48-year-old married dad of 7 kids, ranging in age from 7 to 17. And we also have with us Kenneth Braswell. Now, Kenneth is a married dad of a blended family of 5. Kenneth also runs an Atlanta-based organization called Fathers Incorporated. It works to build stronger families and communities through the promotion of responsible fatherhood. Thank you guys for joining me tonight. I want to wish you an early happy Father's Day.
Thank you. Same to you.
So let's be honest. Often the picture painted of Black fatherhood has been one of absent fathers or deadbeat dads. But let's take a look at some of the facts. According to a recent study by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 70% of Black fathers are most likely to be involved in everyday activities with their children. And that's compared with 60% for white dads and 45% for Hispanic fathers. So do those stats surprise you, or do they really confirm what you have known all along about Black dads, Roderick?
No, I actually don't. I don't believe, I don't. It doesn't surprise me. I just should say. I think Black fathers, we are with the epitome of fathers. I believe the love, the patience, the kindness that we show, just in the community. I think it's normal for us. I think so. A 70% rate of fathers being there and present in a child's life. I'm not shocked by that.
What do you think, Kenneth? Are you shocked by that at all?
Same for me. It's not shocking to me. You know, I really believe that this has always been the case, that fathers are always a part of their children's life in some way or another. I think the backdrop statistic that gives that some framing is the fact that a little over 70% of all African-American children are born into out-of-wedlock households. But one would lead you to believe that that stat is saying 73% of our African-American children are living in fatherless homes. While they may be living in fatherless homes, they're not living in fatherless lives. Just because they're born out of wedlock doesn't mean that fathers are not in the lives of their children. So we were thankful for the research when it began to really show that fathers are still actively engaged in the lives of their children. Yeah, we're going to find them when we look, but when we don't look, we feel like they don't exist.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that's really, I think, interesting about those statistics is that we often don't see the, fathers doing what they're supposed to do because they're not running around with pom-poms saying, rah, 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 yay, yay, I'm a responsible father and I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. They're just doing it, Rod. And I think that's part of the picture that often is not painted.
I think that's part of the humility of being a Black father, You know, all of the things that we all the things that we do. I'm not supposed to. I mean, to go around and you know, I guess you'd say the pomp and circumstance associated with doing the things that I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to, if I have a baby, change diapers. I'm supposed to make dinner. I'm supposed to tutor and help my kids with their homework. I'm supposed to do these things. I'm supposed to go to the PTA. You know, these are not. It's not a surprising thing. It's something we're supposed to do. So of course, it shouldn't be pomp and circumstance for something that I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. You know, Kenneth, for you, you have a blended family. First of all, let's talk a little bit about how that is defined for those who may not be wholly familiar with that.
Mm-hmm. You know, a blended family is a family that's not defined by the traditional rules, meaning everybody under the same roof is a part of the same bloodline. And that's just not the case in many of our families. Some of our families, you know, are put together in very interesting ways. The couple may not be married. They might be married. There may be multiple parents to the multiple children. There may be grandparents in the house. There may be cousins that we call uncle. There may be uncles that we call daddy. There may be all kinds of things in our community that define what we look for when we talk about family. And so for my family, you know, we came together in a way that most families come together through failed relationships or broken relationships or great relationships, all of those things. But at least if everybody under the same umbrella of the family recognizes themselves as family, who are you to define them and tell them that we're not family?
So, Kenneth, let's talk about the whole responsible fatherhood piece, because it sounds like you came with some children, your wife came with children. Did you have to rethink what it means to be a responsible father when you entered into this blended family situation? Did your perspective change at all?
You know, my perspective on being a father had to evolve, right? And it had to evolve starting with me not having my own father in my life and being able to have or to start my family with a blank slate. Starting with trying to figure out the difference between what's a good father and what's a good man. You know, we were talking earlier about our daughters, right? My daughters are focused enough to understand that the kind of man he is will dictate the kind of father he is. And so you really have to define for us, particularly as Black fathers, what does it mean to be a responsible man? What does it mean to show up in the life of your children, your family, and your community as men, and then begin to find a safe and healthy pathway to understanding how to show up in the lives of your children as a father, to take on those responsibilities, to be what I like to describe as a gentle warrior, to be able to manage both your compassion and your strength equally and when it's necessary. And so there's a lot of work in the evolution for us as men to get to a healthy, safe space of being fathers that we dismiss.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, Roderick, when we talk about the challenges of being a father, your situation is unique. Let's just be honest. You have a lot of children, 7 children. Talk to me about the challenges of parenting and fatherhood when you have so many children.
I think the preeminent lesson or thing that I try to explicate and provide to my children, the things that I've learned from my parents, from my mom and my dad, is love. So if I love my children, then here's, I think this is a key piece. If I love them, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to make mistakes. I have many opportunities to learn, if you will. Nonetheless, if I love them, that my love will cover many of the mistakes because inevitably we're going to make mistakes, especially when you have 7 like I do. You know, I look at my oldest son, And I tell him,
We may be having a bit of an issue with hearing you there, Rod. We're gonna work on that. I want to pose that same question to Kenneth. Kenneth, what are the specific challenges of being a father to 5 children when automatically you did not come in to this particular marriage with 5 children? This was, again, this blended family situation.
And by the way, I was continuing to hear Rod, but just to piggyback on what he was saying is that one of the things that you have to do is not to think that all of your children are the same. But the importance of creating an environment where they all feel valued the same is what's important in a blended family. And so my first daughter was as a result of being a young guy, 17 years old, not even out of high school, dropping out of high school, having a child, going into the military, and being out of her life in the beginning, first 7 years of her life, because I was young, dumb, and stupid myself. And then waiting, and that's just real talk, right? And so because of that failure with her, I made a declaration on my life that I was not having any more children in my life. It was 19 years later before my second daughter was born, and she was the game changer for me. When she was born, it said to me as a young man who was at that point, in my early 30s, that you got to stop playing. You got to put, as the Bible says, you got to put away playthings, and you got to get real, and you got to step up and be real in her life. And even though the relationship between me and her mom didn't work out after a year and a half, and that's our romantic relationship, we still had to find a way to be co-parents in our life. And we made a collective commitment together to, even though we weren't in a relationship, to be mindful that we had to have a relationship. And we did a very great job in raising, my youngest daughter. My second daughter came as a result of my wife, who never knew her father. My fourth daughter just came into my life 5 years ago that I did not know existed. That was a product of a relationship that I had when I was in the military some 35 years ago. And my son, who's 13, was a surprise blessing, my only boy, that now I have to kind of figure out, after being a girl dad for so many years, how do I raise this black boy in a society that things are not stacked up in his favor? And then lastly, because I always say I have 5+1, I now have guardianship over my 14-year-old nephew out of New York that I'm also trying to raise, who also never had his father in his life. And for all of them, the critical thing for me is to make sure that they are all equally valued in my life.
One of the things that, and I'm assuming, Kenneth, that obviously you came from some of your children came from a previous relationship.
Absolutely.
What was that like when in dealing with the mother of the previous relationship in co-parenting, when you are now entering into this new relationship and you have this different kind of family?
I was blessed, even though our relationships didn't work out the way you would hope relationships worked out. I was blessed to always be involved with loving, compassionate, logically thinking women who, irregardless of what our relationship was romantically, we were still able to be friends and get over those rocky points. As I began to mature and really understand that, family was not just about bloodlines, but it was about being responsible and taking care of the things that you bring into this world, i.e. our kids, that you manage your relationships in that way, and you get in where you fit in, and you do what you need to do to ensure that your children have the maximum amount of love from both of their parents that you can give them, and that they can see that in operation, right? And so for me with them, it was a very logical thing. My wife will tell you that when we began dating, we had a conversation before we got serious. And I said to her, Like there's more than one relationship that we're responsible for. We're not only responsible for the relationship between you and I. You are also responsible for the relationship between you and my daughter. I'm responsible for the relationship between me and my daughter. We're responsible for the relationship between our two daughters, and we're both responsible for the relationship for the parents of our children. If any of those relationships don't work, we don't work. It's going to create chaos. So we have to be mindful walking into our new relationship, talking about getting married, that we're responsible for more than just one relationship if we're going to be happy in this family.
But,
That's good.
and this is for both of
That's good.
you, not every father, particularly young fathers, have the advantage of co-parenting, even if they're estranged from the mother, of dealing with someone who is civil, level-headed, mature, all of those things. What kind of issues do you believe, Rod, that some of these young guys deal with? Because suffice it to say,
Absolutely.
you are also a pastor, and I'm sure that you had a chance to talk to some young guys as well, and
Absolutely.
deal with those particular struggles and challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned I have several people in mind that I've had the opportunity to work with and talk with and love on in these challenging times that they go with or that they go through. One of the things I think a key thing that we have to do as older fathers is our responsibility to father the younger fathers. We need to help teach them teach them how to deal with those challenges. This is just real life that you have to deal with. Everything is not going to be sunshine and roses, and so we have to teach them how to deal with. I tell them, many times I say, hey, look, I'll give them examples, and with me and my wife, and say, hey, we haven't always been smiling at each other, 24 hours a day, and so I try to give them examples to let them know that you're not alone. I think that's a key piece to know and understand, that whatever it is that you're going through, you're not by yourself. You're not the only one that has dealt with that. I just told my children earlier this week that the enemy has no new tricks. It's always the same thing over and over again. And he tries to figure out who deals with what better or worse, if you will. So,
well, I if I may, share, my own experience where, my daughter, who is now almost 23 years old, she made it.
Congratulations.
but her mother and I, we divorced, and she was very young when we did. And one of the things that I learned and would share with a lot of young guys, and not just the young guys, some of the old heads too, is that you really have to focus on what is in the best interest of the child. I know we hear about that if you have to go to court during the divorce proceedings, if there's child support involved. And fortunately, and I've been saying this since my daughter was very, very small, that we were really good co-parents. It wasn't perfect. I mean, and let's not pretend that it was, but I would say about 85% of the time, because my daughter's mother is an excellent mother. Again, not perfect, but a very, 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 very good mother. And I've been saying that for a really long time. And so because I trusted her, and as it related to, her mothering skills and the like. And I think that younger fathers or fathers who are estranged from the mothers need to kind of take heed, drop the ego, and think about what is important for the child or the children, because in the end, it really is important that the health and welfare, particularly the emotional health and welfare of the child is critically important.
Mhm. With our dads, I always try to take them back to the beginning of how it all started to give them some context. And my saying to them is always, a lot of times in life, irresponsible people engage in irresponsible things that manifest real problems with real consequences. There's nothing like being a child and having to deal with grown-up consequences and problems. And until you mature into those problems, you're going to have a hard time and you're probably going to make a lot of mistakes. As a young dad who enters into relationships not understanding that equation that I just quoted, that's why they get caught up in systems, because they walk into situations not knowing that you're getting ready to engage in behaviors that's going to catch you up in systems that you can't break away from. Child support, incarceration, education, health, all of that stuff related to your children, you have a responsibility for. And if you don't understand the importance of it in your own life, you most definitely are not going to understand it in the life of your child. And then lastly, relationships and communication. If you don't understand how to manage relationships and you don't understand how to communicate, you're going to have an extremely hard time managing life, but still won't relieve you of the responsibility of being a father to the child that you reared. And you're going to have to figure it out. But I think to your point earlier, Harold, about young fathers, I think that's the biggest mistake they make. They walk in engaged in this act that they believe makes them a man, and realize that once the consequence of that act happens, they realize very quickly, I'm not the man I thought I was.
Kenneth, talk to me about your organization for a minute or so to explain what it does to help Black fathers become the best dads they can be.
So our organization, Fathers Incorporated, began in 2004 with an eye to work with fathers around custody, visitation, and child support. And that was only because I was dealing with that. Most people who get into not-for-profit work get into the work that is inspired by their pain, right? So at that time, my pain was dealing with the mother of my youngest daughter and trying to figure out how to manage custody. But when I got into it, I quickly realized that those three things were just symptoms of bigger problems. Not having the right education to get a good job, to get a great wage earning job, getting incarcerated, and all kinds of other things. And really wanted to, as an agency, to begin to do professional development and capacity building for human service agencies that were providing family services, but were leaving fathers and men out of the equation. Fast forward, we are now engaged in direct service here in Atlanta. We just received a grant from the federal government to work with 900 fathers over the next 5 years in providing comprehensive direct services for these fathers. And what that service looks like is, if you're a dad and you come into our ecosystem and you're struggling with being the dad that you're trying to be, we try to figure out what your issue is. If your issue is child support, we try to get you to help and manage that. If you can't pay child support because you don't have a job, we try to get you to manage that. If you don't have a job because you don't have the skills and the education, we try to get you to manage that. If you're not seeing your child because you can't communicate with the mother of your child, we try to get you to manage that. So we really do this kind of triage, direct service delivery with fathers as they come in, because all of them come in with different situations. So one fix for all doesn't work. You really have to bring men in and figure out how they got to where they are, what they're struggling with at the moment, and what are the best things to do for them to allow them to fish, as opposed to just giving them fish.
Excellent, excellent. Now we're going to take a break in just a bit, but before we go, I want both of you to give 2 quick pointers for dads who are trying to reconnect or connect with their children. Are there barriers that are in place because of a challenged relationship, with the mother, for example? What's your advice? Rod, I'll start with you.
I'll just quickly, and maybe we can talk about it more later. But one of the things that I learned, I guess one of the most prolific things that I probably learned from my father is, and he told me this, and as an adult, I wasn't a kid at the time, I was an adult, but he said that I might not be called to win. He said that I might not be called to win. However, I might just be called to try. And, when he first said that, it makes sense. Like, what do you mean? I'm supposed to always win. But over time, I learned what he was talking about. And I've learned, and I've subsequently shared with my children that the goal in life is not always to win, but the goal is to learn through trying, learn through your experiences. And the more that you learn through your experiences, the more knowledge that you gain, the more wisdom that you attain. Now you can call it success. So there's a difference between winning and success.
Interesting.
Like
Same
that.
question for you, Kenneth. Connecting or reconnecting, because there may be some, challenges, whether they be geographic or emotional, or just lack of being able to establish those connections because of issues with the mother.
Yeah. So for me, it is respect wisdom, right? All information can't be Googled. And so surround yourself in accountability circles with people who can advise you on how to walk the journey of your life with making the fewest mistakes that you have to do in order to be successful. Everything that you need to know about being a man and about being a father can be learned from other men who've gone through the same path. And I think oftentimes our youth, particularly our young fathers, believe that they know it all or they can Google it all. And so when they don't look for inspiration, they don't look for information, they don't look for accountability in the men in their circles. And so my thing with them is always to respect wisdom.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and sometimes, obviously, those challenging relationships with the mother may be an impediment to connecting. But if you do have a path to talking, to your child, because sometimes there may be, those forces where, the estranged partner may not hold you in the best regard in talking, with the children. But I think that if you have best intentions and that you have a chance to really talk to your children, and sometimes it may take time, but when they see that you were doing your best, not only in how you present yourself, but what you're doing for them, and really trying to connect with them emotionally, I would argue that that they may very well see it, and that at least that is the hope. We are going to take a quick station break. Of course, we need to say goodbye to our 96.3 WHUR audience, but this conversation continues online and on Sirius XM channel 141 HUR Voices 96.3 HD2 and on 98.3 FM. Black Fatherhood, the challenges and the wins will continue in just a few seconds. Well, thanks for staying with us as we celebrate Black fatherhood and dispel the myths. We have two dads joining us tonight who are a true testament of what dad life really looks like in the Black community. Roderick Avery, 48-year-old married dad of 7. Kenneth Braswell, who is a married dad of a blended family of 5. Hey, Kenneth. Kenneth also runs an Atlanta-based organization called Fathers Incorporated. And we want to talk about the appreciation for Black fatherhood. Now, we know when it comes to dads, The same warm and fuzzy affections often associated with mothers are not always there for the fathers. That is in part because dads traditionally have not been seen as the emotional providers, the nurturers, but the disciplinarians and the financial providers. Yeah, read that as bank. So, we have seen efforts and a shift in that in recent years. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are your thoughts about, fathers going beyond being the stern voices and being a paycheck dad? And how does emotion show up in your relationship with your kids? Roderick, let me pose that to you, because I'm sure with 7 children, the emotional needs of your children varies, not only child to child, but boys, girls, ages, the whole bit.
Yeah, I think the key thing, or one of the key things, is to be willing to learn, willing to evolve, if you will. As I grew up, my father was a very stern disciplinarian, and you do what you learn to do. You act as you learn to act, and you react according to what you've been taught. But what's happened for me over time, because I was willing to learn, because I was willing to humble myself and even look and talk to other dads, as Brother Kenneth mentioned, I'm willing to listen to others, to other dads and other people, including my wife, to say, hey, maybe you need to consider this as a way to discipline the children. I remember just when my son was maybe 2 years old, and again, I do believe in being a disciplinarian, but I needed to learn at that time. I had to learn how to have the nurturing piece of fatherhood at that time as well. And I learned from my wife. After I had to get on my son, and I think I got a little paddle, and after I got the paddle on his legs or whatever, and he was crying, and he cried for a moment, and my wife said, "Okay, now go talk to your son." And that was a moment of enlightenment for me. That was an epiphany for me to say, "Oh, I'm supposed to do more than just be the strong hand. I'm also supposed to be a tender touch." And so at that moment, I went, and because I love my children, I never want to hurt them. I always want to grow them. And so I learned at that time. I went and I got my son after he was crying. I said, "Come over, son, come here, buddy." And he sat on my lap, and I hugged him real tight. And I told him, "This is why Daddy paddled your legs. This is the reason that I did it. But I need you to understand, Daddy loves you. The only reason I did it is because I want you to be a good boy, so Daddy can teach you how to be a good man." And so I think that's the mix and the amalgamation between being stern and a disciplinarian, and also being a nurturing father. I think that's what I've learned, at least.
What about you, Kenneth? When we talk about the perception of fathers being the bank, or not being emotionally connected to your children, what picture of yourself would you paint?
I just want to piggyback on a couple of things that Rod said, because I thought that they were critically important for us to kind of land on. The first thing is, I love when I talk to brothers who talk about their experiences with their dads, those brothers who actually had a full life with their dad, or had an involved life with their dad, or had a presence life with their dad. I think in this field of work, that narrative is more important to talk about than the fatherless narrative is, because the fullness narrative gives you a perspective of why the fatherless narrative is so critical. The second thing is, he talked about learning and evolving in his fatherhood. And I think that we come to this space and we raise this level of expectations with our fathers that leads them to believe that they got to walk into this fatherhood thing perfect. And we don't. We're not perfect. Some days we're going to win. Some days we're going to fail. Some days we're going to get it right. Some days we're going to get it wrong. It just makes us human. But if we focus on the last thing that Rod said, which is whatever I am in the life of my child, as long as I'm engaged and as long as I want to remain commitment, that I do that because I love them and I want the best for them, then fatherhood, parenthood, motherhood, or any other kind of hood works out at some point, right? If you just stay focused on the love part. But, for me, it is exactly what he said. We come to this space with our own issues sometimes. For me, not having a father in my life, I come to it with my own issues that I'm always struggling with. I always struggle with my worthiness, right? So I can forget about my presence sometimes. And sometimes I'm thinking about, wow, am I worthy of my children? Can I fulfill all the expectations that everyone has of me being a father? And if I fail, does it mean I'm a failure, right? If I win, does it mean I'm a winner? If I lose, does it mean I'm a loser? Because society always wants to tag us with these terms that make us believe that we have to buy into these terms. And that has been the biggest problem as it relates to Black fathers and trying to navigate through this space, because there's been these terms that's been tagged to us that we're trying to overcome. And some of them is simply not a way to be able to overcome some of the names and some of the ways that people think about us, other than continue to be present.
Have you evolved as a father? And if so, how?
I've evolved big time. It is, and in the biggest way, it is, I have to be okay with not being okay all the time. I think the thing that I've been talking a lot about over the last 2 weeks is really being mindful of this term expectation, right? Because we all have an expectation of how people show up in our lives. And we also have an expectation of who we are in the lives of people. I think when it comes to parenting, and more specifically when it comes to fatherhood, it is the challenge is from your children finding out what is their expectation of you, because your expectation of yourself may not match their expectation of you. I'll give you a short example. My son is in AAU basketball, and he's good, and I know he's good, and I press him, and I'm telling him, watch out for the defense, play off the ball, get your arm right. And then when I get in the car, you didn't do this right. Then when I get home, you should have did this better. And then on the car back to the practice, you should have did that better. All because I'm trying to make him better. And he's interpreting that as dad is being on me and I can't do anything right. But I don't want to sacrifice not hearing what dad is trying to tell me to be right for his presence. Because I rather deal, and I just heard this from a brother the other day who talked about this with his dad. He says, as much as I hated my dad being critical of me, I would not trade his criticism for his presence.
So let me share my own experience, with my father, who is 83. I always say alive and kicking, just not kicking quite as high. That even though as a child, and I think this is the case with a lot of Black fathers and sons, as sons develop strong wills and fathers who may be traditionally strong-willed, that we often butted heads. But I will say that as I grew older and into a teenager, one of the things that I do remember is that my father did something that I think a lot of fathers did not do, which was to say that he loved me. And I think for modern fathers who have evolved into trying to be more emotionally connected with their children, particularly sons, that to me is important, because as we know, some old school fathers say, well, of course I love my child, but that child may never have heard it.
Right.
And I think that's really important. And I am not ashamed to say or afraid to say that then as now, when I see my father, I hug him, I kiss him on his cheek. And I did that with his father, my grandfather. And I did hug, my mother's father as well. And we are an emotional family. We are an affectionate family. We believe in, tactile connection. And I think that has helped me with my daughter because, we are huggers. And I think it is so important, not just with the relationship that fathers have with their children, but how it helps those children develop emotionally as they move from childhood to teen years to young adulthood. And I think in some ways or another, it allows them to be empathetic and sympathetic to others as they begin to express themselves emotionally. And I think Rod, you may be able to speak to that to some extent.
Yeah, the things that you're mentioning, I mean, you're spot on, Harold, and it resonates with me very strongly as if you're talking about as we all spoken from the perspective of evolution, our fatherhood evolution, if you will. That personally, from the perspective of being dealing with the emotions of dealing with my children. I have 4 girls and I have 3 boys. Part of my evolution, and I again, even from the time that my oldest is a boy, he was 2. From that time, I evolved from that point. But even today, I still see my growth as a person and as a father because dealing with my daughters, I remember dealing with my daughters in one way emotionally, not from the disciplinarian standpoint. I disciplined them all, I guess, equally based upon their need, each one of their needs. However, from the emotional standpoint, I remember even internally, I think it was Shakespeare that said, "To thine own self be true." So internally, I remember my thoughts with regard to the emotionalism and how I dealt with my daughters. And I wouldn't necessarily, I would hug all of my children. I would hug my girls and my boys, but I would kiss my girls and say, baby and sweetie and things like that. However, my own personal evolution has shown me that, hey, even though he's a boy, he's still my baby. I mean, he might be 17, but he's still my baby. And now I'm at a place where I hug and I kiss my boys and my girls. I don't treat them differently because I love them all. So that's my own personal evolution. One of the things in that same light, I remember as a 30-year-old man, I remember the first time that my dad kissed me on the forehead. Mm-hmm. And that had a huge impact upon me because it let me know that, hey, yeah, I'm a man and I'm strong. I have testosterone, but I can still be nurtured by my father.
Wow.
I think that is so important because I remember, I can't say I remember the first time, but I do remember as a child, my father doing the same because my father had a beard for years and years and years. And when my father would kiss me, on the cheek or on the forehead, good night, I would feel that beard. And I still, remember that. And I think that is part of the early connections that last through the rest of your life. And speaking of connections with your children, Kenneth, how do you make lasting connections with your children? How do you make that work? Do you think about that kind of thing? Have you spoken to your children about how you've connected with them?
Mm-hmm. Don't think that I've had a direct conversation about connecting with them, but I'm always conscious about the connecting. It's interesting hearing the two of you tell your stories about remembrance of those things that your father did unknowingly that that had a lasting impact on you. And I want to just share quickly a fatherlessness connect that brought me closer to my son as a result of the absence of my own father. There was a point where we were in a barbershop one day, and KJ must have been maybe 2 years old or so, and we were getting a haircut, and he was standing between my legs doing whatever he was doing, playing on a tablet or doing whatever our young kids do at those ages. And there was this moment where I looked down at him, and I looked around the barbershop, and I thought to myself, wow, I wonder what it must feel like to be in a barbershop with your dad. Right. And it was
Wow.
it was a different connect. It was, whoa, this is a moment I missed, but I'm fulfilling it now, but I'm wondering what it felt like. And as a result of understanding that connection in the moment, that my son would never have to think what I was thinking. Like when my son takes his son to the barbershop, he will never look at his son and say, I wonder what it must be like to be a dad with my son in the shop, because he would have experienced it already. So
Kenneth, but here's the other piece to that. Because you didn't have a father in your life, can you give what you've not had, or did you create an idea of what you believe fatherhood should be like, and then take that into your road down the fatherhood path?
I had to think about it differently. It wasn't just the act. It was what you were talking about. It is, what is the connector, right? What is the thing that I was missing at that particular moment as a connection to my dad, and recreating scenarios and things in our lives that allowed me to always be connected to my children in a way that I desired to be connected to my dad. One of the other things that I do with my son is, since he was born, I always rubbed his head. I always rubbed his head, no matter where he was, what we were doing. If he was standing next to me, he's now 13 years old. He's probably 6 inches from being the same height as me, and I still rub his head. And it's interesting because sometimes if I'm standing next to him and we're just standing there talking, sometimes he'll grab my hand and put it on his head. And what it says to me is that I figured out how to make the connection without having to be so specific and doing the things that I wish my dad would have done with me, but trying to ensure that my son walks away in life with understanding that me and my dad, no matter what situation we're in, I'm connected.
That's so important. And none of the things that any of us have spoken about have anything to do with money. and they have nothing to do with, going to the store and shopping. I mean, my first memory of my father, I mean, the first really clear, long memory is when he told me to put my coat on one Saturday morning, early in the morning, and said, we're going. And I think I may have been about 5 years old or something like that. I mean, certainly there were other memories, but this was so significant, where we hopped in the car and he took me to Skyline Drive in the Shenandoah Mountains. And he bought me my very first comic book, which was a Doc Savage comic book, which, you got to be of a certain age to even know who that is. But, and I will never forget that. But also, those moments can be created not just when you're a child, but even as a man, when Rod, you're a Kappa, I'm a Kappa, we're in the same fraternity. My father's a Kappa. And, Kenneth, I don't know if you're a part of an organization. Yeah, well, there's still time, brother. But, I made my father pledged Kappa after I did. And to walk him through that process is just as powerful a memory and connection as the Skyline Drive experience.
Wow.
And so it's so important to continue to connect with your children as a father, even though they are no longer children, and they are adults. And I think that's really critical.
Right.
I look at the things that you're saying, and one of the I believe that it deals with humility. I was listening to what Kenneth mentioned with regard to not having his father there, but even though my father was there, when I deal with and think about teaching my children, my father is one of the teachers, their grandfather. However, I have to be willing to allow a whole host of others to teach my children. I want my children to be better than me. So if I want my children to be better than me, I need to make sure that they are encamped or a host of people encamped around them that know more than I know.
Mm.
And that takes humility, because sometimes we want to look and say, to our kids, we know everything. Well, no, we don't know everything. And so I have to have other people around me that know so much more than me, so that my children can learn things that I'm not able to teach them. I want all of my children to be better at everything that I am than I am. So,
real quick, and I'll start with you, Rod, because you have daughters, and of course, Kenneth, you do as well. Real brief, how important is your relationship with your daughters as it relates to the fact that down the road they are going to have relationships with men? What are you doing now to make sure that kind of connection for them is a pristine as much as possible?
Yes, absolutely. I'm making sure, and it's not just me. I think that's a key thing, because they have brothers. One of the things that my wife and I mention frequently to my oldest son, and even to the baby boys, but especially to my oldest son, I say, hey, you are the men in your sister's lives. And so the things that you say, the way you treat them, the way you love them, the way you respect them, then that's how they believe. That's how they learn what a man is supposed to be.
Okay. Real quick, Kenneth, 30 seconds, your thoughts about, the relationship with daughters as it relates to how they may deal with men later in life.
Yeah, with me, it was simple messaging. You are a queen that deserves a king. And once you understand and recognize king qualities, you'll understand the beginnings and the remnants of that in a prince, because you're not oftentimes going to get the king. Sometimes you have to be able to invest in the frog, right?
Yeah.
And that's my wife and my story. I tell my kids all the time, your mother knew the right frog. I was not a king when she met me. I was a frog that turned into a prince when she kissed me, and I grew into being a king. And that
that's
process,
good to hear. At least there weren't any warts. Real just a final thought from each of you. Just 30 seconds, real quick. I'll start with you, Rod. Final thought.
Fatherhood is a blessing. Being a father is the most. I'll say this: when I first got married, I was so excited about being a husband. However, there's a different level of love that I never thought that I would experience until first time that I became a father. So fatherhood is a challenge, but it's worth it.
Real quick, Kenneth, same thing, 20 seconds, final thought.
For me, don't miss a minute because you might miss a moment. Be as present as you possibly can.
Yeah, I like that. You know, love your children as best as you can. Gentlemen, thank you so very, very much for spending some time with us. It's so important that we have this conversation. I want to thank you both for joining for this conversation tonight, celebrating Black fatherhood and dispelling the myths. As we stated at the top of the program, the vast majority of Black fathers have a daily presence in the lives of their children. That's a narrative that for far too long has gone unnoticed and not celebrated. So as we move to honor dads this Sunday, let's go beyond the socks and ties for dads and put some real thought into what we can all do to lift up fathers and push those dads who may still be struggling to get it right. Happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. I'm Harold Fisher. Thanks for watching and listening. Good night.